Okay, so you want to know more about sales agreements, right? Well, strap in, because today we're going deep on sales agreements.
That's right.
You sent us some really fascinating stuff about this, so we're going to unpack it all for you and hopefully give you some knowledge that you can use whether you're buying or selling.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people think sales agreements are, just these boring legal things, but honestly, they're kind of fascinating. And knowing how they work can really give you a lot of control.
I thought this is a cool way to put it. The material we're looking at today says a sales agreement's like uh, like a legally binding peace treaty.
Right.
Keeps everybody happy, avoids those nasty legal battles later on.
Exactly, exactly. Even little tiny misunderstandings can turn into huge legal messes if you don't sort them out from the beginning. So let's start with the basics. The podcast you sent over starts by talking about how important it is to identify the people involved.
Yeah, and it's more than just like knowing their name. It's like full legal names, addresses, maybe even business details if it's a company. That seems like, pretty important to make the agreement really solid.
Absolutely. Imagine you end up in some kind of dispute and you can't even figure out who is actually responsible for what. That's a nightmare. And then comes the description of whatever it is that's being sold, and this is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. The podcast mentioned this story about a guy who bought a vintage car, but they never actually figured out what vintage meant. And you know what? That little mistake ended up costing the buyer thousands of dollars.
Oof, yeah, that's why being super clear is so important. Like, if it's a car, you need the year, the model, the VIN number, the mileage, even how good or bad the condition is. And that goes for anything you're selling, a car, a machine, a service, even like ideas and stuff.
So it's not just about saying what it is you're selling, but it's about avoiding arguments later on. Are there other times when a vague description could cause problems?
Oh, absolutely. Like, let's say you're selling software. You have to be really specific about what the software can do, what kind of support comes with it, and what it can't do. If you don't make those things crystal clear, you're just asking for trouble.
Okay, so we've got the people sorted out. We've got a crystal clear description of what's being sold. Now what about the price?
Right, so that brings us to the purchase price and the payment terms. This part's not just about the amount of money. You have to lay out how the payment's going to happen, when it's due, and what happens if someone's late with the cash.
And speaking of awkward money conversations, the podcast mentioned this case where two friends went to court over a payment plan. They had like a verbal agreement, but nothing was written down, and things went south.
Yeah, that's such a classic example of why you've got to write everything down. Our memories can be fuzzy,
Yeah.
and it's really hard to prove what you agreed to if it wasn't written down. This section of the agreement also has to cover things like loans, down payments, and whether there will be interest charged on late payments.
So we've covered who's involved, what's being sold, and how much it'll cost. Now, what happens when it's time to actually deliver the goods?
That's where we get into delivery and transfer of ownership. This part spells out when and how the thing will be delivered, who's paying for the shipping, and the exact moment when the buyer officially owns it.
You mentioned earlier that you're selling an antique piece of furniture, right? That sounds like it could raise some logistical questions about the delivery.
Exactly. And this is where you address all of that. Things like insurance while it's being moved, if it needs to be inspected, and what happens if it gets damaged or lost during delivery.
The podcast also talked about warranties and disclosures, which sounds like a real minefield.
Oh, for sure. When you're selling something, you absolutely have to disclose any problems you know about, and that's where as is comes in. Selling something as is doesn't mean you can hide problems, though. It just means the buyer's taking it with those flaws.
So as is doesn't give sellers an excuse to be sneaky.
No, not at all. In fact, if you don't disclose known issues, you could get into legal trouble even if you sold it as is. This part of the agreement should lay out any guarantees you're offering and any disclaimers about the condition of the item.
And lastly, the podcast mentioned contingencies. Can you break those down for us a little?
Sure. Contingencies are basically conditions that have to be met before the sale is final. Like, a buyer might say they'll only buy the thing if they can get a loan or if an inspection goes well.
So it's kind of like a safety net for both sides, making sure they can back out if something's not right.
Exactly. And of course, even the most detailed agreement is worthless if it isn't signed and dated by both parties.
Right. That's what makes it official and legally binding. As you can see, there's a lot more to sales agreements than you might think.
Absolutely. It's not just a formality. It's a really powerful tool to protect yourself and make sure the whole process goes smoothly. And knowing the ins and outs of each part can be the difference between a good deal and a legal nightmare.
So thinking about your own situation, what surprised you about sales agreements? How will this knowledge change how you approach buying and selling from now on? That's something for you to think about as you look into all this material. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
If this podcast helped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep making these videos. Thanks for watching.